Hey guys, Sly here, and welcome back to another episode of the Caspian Game Awards. Tonight, we are going to be covering 1994, as well, requested by everyone else in the Discord. So, well, some shameless plug, check that out. But before we actually get into that, of course, I do want to talk about a few things. So first of all, I do apologize about the fact that I had to delay this. Honestly, because of the fact that I streamed every single day last week, I did want to give myself a bit of a breather day. And so, because of that, I had to push this back a little bit, but that's fine, because don't worry, we'll still be doing the 93 Caspian Awards, and, well, just the rest of the 90s in general, but I just wanted to make sure that I gave myself a bit of a breather, just to mentally prepare for those, as well as to give myself a bit of extra time to be able to work on that slideshow. Which, of course, gets us into probably the most relevant pieces of news that we've got. So, of course, in the 98 video, I did mention that the Game Awards were announced for December 12th. And if you guys were on our stream, you might have noticed that we did a full-on live reaction of this particular show. And I've mentioned before that we will be covering the 2024 Caspian Game Awards at some point in January. I just want to make sure that I give myself enough time to be able to do all the research that I need to do in order to really go through that. And truth be told, if any of you guys have seen my reaction, I was less than impressed with this year. Granted, in hindsight, I don't think this was the worst year of the Game Awards show, but god damn it, they just cannot seem to stick with actually doing the awards properly, and just focusing way too much on advertisements. Not necessarily the game announcements were bad, because there were some games that I am genuinely pretty excited that they announced, like Killing Floor 3, or that they showed off, like Killing Floor 3, the Okami sequel, Onimusha sequel. Those I think are pretty cool. And Witcher 4 and all the stuff like that. But, well, there were also a bunch of announcements for a lot of games that either I just didn't really care for, or there were just a lot of, just frankly, bullshit that they showed off. Including a very controversial AI thing, which I pointed out on stream, that has been a huge controversy for the past few days. And low-key kind of hypocritical with the message that they were trying to do, as far as talking about video game layoffs. So, I don't know. Frankly, this show was just, in a lot of ways, a bit of a disaster. But obviously, we'll talk about that once we do the official stream talking about 2024. But I just wanted to point that out, that if you guys want to see my live reactions, of course, make sure you guys check out the saved VODs on my YouTube channels. I made sure that I streamed on those as well, so that the stream is documented, because I haven't been saving a lot of my streams on Twitch anymore. I've been making sure that they've been saved on YouTube. So if you guys want to check that out, feel free to do so. We did get technically copyright hit, but we're only blocked in some countries, like Russia and Belarus of all places, but you know, it is what it is. But also, I wanted to give a bit of a special announcement, because obviously this game has been a part of my life for the past 3 years, and let's just say it has affected me in more ways than not. But happy birthday, Security Breach, I guess. I don't know, I just wanted to point that out, because you guys know how I feel about certain characters here. Like, wait, where is it? Oh, there it is. In the freeze to cut these lips, I love you. I just wanted to at least give it a special announcement for that. And also, happy birthday to my second album that I released 2 years ago. But let's not focus on that. Let's go back 30 years ago, which, holy shit, that's a long ass time ago. God damn it. So what was that? Sorry about that. Anyways, so 1994. That was 30 years ago. Oh my god. Granted, obviously, I wasn't born in 94, if you guys can't tell. But even just thinking about that makes me feel old, because a lot of the stuff that I love came out from 94. I mean, just look at my shirt. I'm wearing Green Day's Dookie, one of my favorite albums of all time. Also, a lot of really damn good albums besides this came out. Obviously, Weezer's Blue Album, Soundgarden Super Unknown, some Dome Temple Pilots Purple, Korn self-titled. Like, it was a pretty damn good year as far as music is concerned. Movies was decent as well. I'm not gonna pretend it was the best year for movies, but it was a decent year. I mean, Lion King came out that year. Also, Shawshank Redemption came out that year as well. So it was a very big year as far as media is concerned. But what about video games? Honestly, a pretty good year, if I'd say. Now, there is a bit of a narrative that I've seen online from people saying that, like, there's been a general consensus by certain YouTube channels that I'm not gonna say right like here, that have pretty much been slandering 94 as being the absolute worst year in gaming history. And I have to put my foot down and say, no, this is not the worst year in gaming history. Was there bullshit that came out that year that sucked as far as video games? Of course, every year has that. And as a matter of fact, I am going to be frank, there was a lot of, like, terrible games that came out in 94. That being said, though, I found a decent amount of games that kind of counterbalanced a lot of that crap. So I consider that this was actually arguably one of the better years. Okay, let me rephrase that. It was definitely a year that I feel like was counterbalanced to where it was more good than bad. There was a bit of an edge as far as the good to bad. So yeah, suffice to say, I can't agree with people saying that this was the worst year. Maybe as far as video game events, but we don't talk about video game events. We talk about the games themselves. And if we're talking about the games strictly, no, 94 was not the worst year in gaming history. I don't know why that narrative has been, spreading around. It's not even close. Hell, this isn't even close to the top 5 worst years we talked about on this show. Trust me, we've covered some terrible years in gaming history. And, well, truth be told, as a slight spoiler alert, we're not quite done yet with the shit list there. But yeah, you get the point. 94, it was definitely like a peak year, I would say, as far as games themselves. Or, like, the 4th generation of video game consoles. We were just at the very cusp of the 5th generation, and how the PlayStation 1 and the Sega Saturn, they were already released in Japan in December 94, which is funny because it's December 2024. Again, 30 years old. Oh my god, I feel old. But you get the point. I think this year was a decent year. Not a great year, but definitely a lot more notable than a lot of people give it credit. So let's talk about that. And of course, if you guys already, know about the series, of course, we'll just kind of continue. But for the short version, for people who are new, basically I make my own game awards for, throughout several decades of gaming history, all the way up to 1990. And yeah, we just kind of give out awards to games that deserve it. So, and of course, as a bit of a refresher for those who might be new or who might not remember, of course, these are the particular rules that we've had for a while, and I don't think they're really going to change that much. Actually, before we actually move on to that, we're going to... Yeah, we're going to remove one rule on there, because I don't think it's really relevant anymore. So... It's not completely irrelevant, but I'd say it's relevant, and I'd say it's irrelevant enough to where it's not really necessary anymore. So, of course, as far as the general rules are concerned, basically, again, we covered the entire year of the year of topic. We don't do weird cutoff dates because, again, we're not like the Oscars. We're not like the actual Game Awards. We're not like the Grammys. We're not dumb like that. We do the entire year from January to December.
Don't yell at me, yell at the Grammys.
We're not stupid like that. And, well, truth be told, we also make sure that we limit the categories to where it's a decent amount that we can cover while not having too little or too much, so only 4 to 6 nominees will be allowed per category. Also, we count the initial release date. We don't just count North American releases, we're also considering Japanese and European releases as well. So, yeah. And those are the general nominee qualifications. As far as Game of the Year, again, because we're moving further and further away from review sites like IGN and Metacritic, we're definitely getting into the weeds as far as old school journalist websites here, if there were even any journalist websites that existed around this time. So we're just going to be talking about games that are generally liked by the general public for it to be accepted for Game of the Year. Though, if absolutely necessary, I'll just start nominating games that I personally like. That's not going to really be a problem until probably once we finish the decade, but we'll get to that when we get to that. And, of course, as always, these are just, games that I'm personally interested in, and the only games that I really want to talk about, if I'm going to be honest, because that's just kind of my thing. Though if you disagree, that is completely fine. Of course, you guys can feel free to chime in whenever this gets re-uploaded onto YouTube. So with that being said, these are our categories this time around, and as you can tell, I finally got rid of the sports racing fighting category because, again, you guys already know me, I'm not the biggest fan of that category to begin with, and it was very, very slim pickings for 1994. I just could not find anything that really appealed to me personally. So do keep that in mind, is that this is a very biased list, but at the end of the day, I'd rather be truthful to myself than just straight up lie to you about a game that, frankly, I don't really care about to begin with. So, but yeah, also, I think we got rid of the expansion category last time, so that's not on there either. So, again, we are slowly losing categories more and more as we go on, but that is admittedly to be expected as we go further and further away from the modern day. I mean, we're pretty far removed from the modern era of gaming to begin with, but especially once we start getting to the end of the night, to the very beginning of the 90s, yeah, that's going to be pretty tough. But I think these are generally the categories that we will be having from this point onwards. So do keep that in mind as well. But in any event, let's begin. Starting off with the best game by new studio. God, I don't know why I said it like that. Goddamn. So best game by new studio. Admittedly, this was actually a pretty easy picking for me. Not as easy as some other years, but definitely an easy enough amount of games that came to my mind that had debuts from a bunch of very popular studios nowadays that came out in 1994. It's actually pretty insane thinking about what studios actually started around this time, and the weight in which their name and brand have stuck around the past 3 decades. It's actually insane. So let's see what I ended up choosing, shall we? So yeah, we've got ourselves some pretty humble names right here. But of course, let's start with the beginning over here, with Mythos Games. Technically not their first game, but again, this is not the first game. It's the first game that got these studios' attention. XCOM, UFO Defense. So yeah, the first XCOM game came out 30 years ago in 1994. And well, of course you guys know me. I've talked about XCOM plenty of times before. It is kind of one of my personal favorite strategy games ever. I have not streamed it for you guys. I really want to. It's just been hard because I wasn't able to with my old computer. But anyways, besides modern day problems, the original XCOM came out 30 years prior, and you can definitely tell that these guys were experienced with their craft. Like I said, this technically wasn't Mythos Games' first game, but this was definitely the first game that got them a lot of press and attention. And so that's why it's getting nominated here. And as far as being one of the earliest examples of a turn-based tactical strategy game is concerned, yeah, no, this game, despite it being this old, actually does hold up to this day. I actually think it's pretty enjoyable in a lot of ways, and kind of feels like a game that if someone were to make it now, that'd be fine. This game holds up in a lot of ways. It hasn't aged perfectly, but I don't know, just the ability to be able to create an entire, basically, just squadron of guys, because in this game you can have up to 12 guys, which is insane, and also just building up your tech tree, and just roaming around a lot of, like, farms and fields. It gives a very unique atmosphere that I do appreciate. And so, yeah, XCOM, I'm going to give it a nod. It's a genuinely good game. And then we've got a game that I've covered last year that, well, I did have choice words after replaying it, but I think I have to keep in mind that this was a Mac release, and so I have to be humble about this. We got the first Marathon game, which, of course, you guys probably already know by now. This was made by Bungie. This was their first big release that got them a lot of attention. And as far as first-person shooters are concerned, it's not my favorite, but I at least do respect the game because of what it was trying to achieve. Because it was one of the first games to try to have a bit of a lore backstory within it. And the general art direction I've always liked with this game. That's like the one thing that I will always give this praise, is its science fiction-y mid-90s look that I always like when it comes to these types of science fiction games, or just media in general. And due to that, I basically just had to throw up my hands and be like, okay, even though it may not have aged the best, I can at least understand why people like this game. And truth be told, I was one of those people. And a part of me still is. So I still want to at least give it a little bit of respect. And then we got Kingsfield, which is a game series that we've been talking about several times in the past streams. But lo and behold, you guys probably don't realize who this was made by. And it's by a big studio that is very popular nowadays. So I made a bit of a joke how this was a game made from a very popular software company from Japan. And they may have been very popular by putting a lot of soul into their games. Can you catch my drift now? Yes. If you guys can't catch my drift, yes, this is From Software's very first game. And as far as Japanese exclusive release, because this was originally released in Japan in 94 before getting ported over into North America in 95. As far as a game like this, for the PlayStation 1, by the way, this was I don't think this was technically a PlayStation 1 launch in Japan, but it was definitely one of the first games released for the system. Yeah, you can definitely see the little wrinkles of DNA of what they would eventually do with the Souls games. Granted, it's not a perfect game. First-person RPGs, especially from around this time, have always been kind of janky in a lot of ways, and this game is no exception. But as far as being a console release, I gotta be honest, it's pretty impressive. So, Kingsfield, I'm gonna give a bit of respect to, especially considering that, again, this is made by FromSoft. And, I mean, they're massive now. Everyone and their mother loves FromSoft. And, well, this game also had, I think, around, 100,000 copies sold, so it's qualifiable for best game by new studio anyways. It's not an obscure game. So that's pretty cool. But last but not least, we've got ourselves Heretic, which, funny enough, this was also another game that I covered 3 years ago back in 2021. And this was made by Raven Software, who would eventually make the Soldier of Fortune games, and unfortunately, for better or for worse, well, probably for worse, eventually became a secondary Call of Duty studio, which, I mean, yeah, it's not the greatest fate. But this was their first game that showed that they had a lot of talent under their belt. And for being what is essentially a total conversion of Doom, this was actually a very impressive game that I actually thoroughly enjoyed. Maybe not necessarily the expansion that came with this, but the base game was fun enough. Especially since it was a first-person shooter set in a fantasy game. Well, it was a fantasy first-person shooter, which was not a very common thing at the time, and still isn't. And so I want to give it some props for that. So, generally speaking, we've got some really damn good choices here as far as new upcoming studios. Or just even new IPs that would have become very popular. But what is the ultimate winner? Well, let's find out. So, the award for the best game by a new studio for 1994 goes to Heretic. Admittedly, this is a bit of a safe choice for me personally because I really do like retro shooters, like old school first-person shooters like this. But I gotta be real with you guys, this is actually a pretty good hidden gem. It's one of those games that I would highly recommend, especially if you are a fan of something like Doom. Which, well, that gets us into one of the reasons why I'm giving this a win. It was essentially, basically just Wizard Doom. It literally quite used the same exact engine. It used id Tech 1. So it already is it's already a very familiar feeling game. But what makes this game stand out is, well, the fact that it is a fantasy game. Because most first-person shooters are typically just either military shooters, science fiction shooters, or just contemporary shooters in general. This was kind of, even for its time, very different, considering that you were using wands and you were using different types of staffs or staves, whatever you want to call them, to dispatch a bunch of the different enemies, which you were fighting different gargoyles, golems, dark knights, necromancers. That was the general tone of this game. And as someone who is a very big fantasy aficionado, I really appreciate that. And just the general detailing of the weapon models for each sprite attack, it's actually very impressive, especially for a new upcoming studio like this that admittedly did have some ties with id Software, but it wasn't necessarily a lot of the same people. This was an upcoming new studio that this was basically their first game. And this was 2 years after Wolfenstein 3D. I don't know about you, but that's pretty impressive. And, well, considering that this game was running on the same engine as Doom, and there was a lot of the same mechanics, you can argue that this was essentially one of the first popular mods, I guess, for, a video game. Which it's kind of dirty calling this a mod, because obviously I don't want to feel like I'm disrespecting Raven Software when I call it a mod. Although, to be fair, a lot of very popular games that we've talked about were originally derived from mods themselves. So this just represented a direction of a lot of other studios for the next several decades to come, that you can just, you can take the base of an already amazing game and make it your own. And that's something that I do appreciate, and is something that I highly encourage. But unfortunately, nowadays, a lot of gaming studios just discourage the use of mods because they actually want to gain all the profit, and that's pretty sad. So, yeah, big tear right there. But you get my point. In my opinion, I think Heretic, because of what it represents, I think it earns the spot for best game by new studio. So, yeah. But then that gets us into our next category, which is, of course, the action-adventure category. Funny enough, this was actually a pretty easy game, all things considered. Or, excuse me, this was a pretty easy category compared to other categories, other times we've had to talk about action-adventure games. Because this was around the time when the lines of both action and adventure games were finally starting to be blurred. And I think that was definitely for the better. But as far as what I ended up choosing, a lot of obscure games on here, but games that I actually thought were pretty fun regardless. So let's talk about them. First off, we got ourselves The Ninja Warriors, which is actually a sequel to an arcade game from 1987 that was released on the Super Nintendo. It is a beat 'em up style of game, and I mean, I'm not gonna lie, this game was actually pretty fun. I was just playing this on my SNES Classic for research purposes, and I'm not gonna lie, this is probably one of the best beat 'em up games I've played in a while. I don't know, just the fact that you're able to swap between 3 different characters that have very different movesets, and that feels so damn smooth to control. That's one thing that I really do appreciate about this game, is that it feels a lot smoother compared to other beat 'em ups on the Super Nintendo at the time. And the fact that it was able to play like that, I think worked in this game's favor. And I don't know, this is a bit of a Super Nintendo hidden gem. I'm pretty sure this is also on the Genesis, though don't take my word to heart on that one. I'm not entirely sure. But I don't know, just the fact that this was a pretty enjoyable beat 'em up game that not a lot of people have really talked about, I wanted to at least give it an honorable mention, as far as a nomination here. So, yeah. A recommendation from me. And then we got Super Metroid. I mean, this is one of those games that is pretty much sacred in a lot of people's eyes. It is highly regarded as being one of the best Super Nintendo games, period. And this was the game that really brought Metroid into a completely other level. I mean, the atmosphere alone should pretty much tell you about how damn good of a game this is. And just how much overall better it is compared to the original Metroid. Oh my god, it's night and day. Not that the original Metroid was bad, it just is very much a Super Nintendo game, or that's just a very much an NES game. So having a game that was not too different from that, but improved in every single way, oh my god, it was actually pretty enjoyable. So, yeah, no, Super Metroid, pretty cool if you ask me. Next up, we got System Shock. Now, I know I called this game a first-person shooter 3 years ago on our FPS tier list, but in hindsight, that was a mistake. System Shock isn't really a first-person shooter, as it's more of a action-adventure game. Yeah, there's some shooting in it, but that's not the main primary focus of the game. The main focus of the game is for you to be able to basically just get out of the facility that you're in while using things like melee combat and all that fun stuff. So it's a lot more general action adventure, which is why it's here. And this game was pretty ambitious for its time. Like Marathon, it was one of those games that tried to add in a lot of in-depth lore and background story into its general gameplay. And that's something that I think is pretty cool about this game. It is definitely a game from 1994, though, so it's going to feel a bit awkward, especially if you're playing the original version of this game. I know there's the remake, but let's not focus on that. There was a refurbished version, I think, released back in 2015. That does fix some of the weird jankiness that the original version had. So if there's any version of the original game that I'd recommend, it's probably that 2015 re-release. But yeah, this is definitely a game that I think was definitely more impressive for its time. And is a game that I do respect for being one of the games that really pioneered a lot of the storytelling in a lot of popular games that would come out decades later. So in that respect, I wanted to give it the nomination here. And then we got ourselves a licensed game. Super Star Wars Return of the Jedi. Yes, this is in fact a real game. As a matter of fact, the original Star Wars trilogy was adapted onto the Super Nintendo as the Super Star Wars trilogy. And this was the last game in that sort of trilogy. They are hard games, but they are still games that I actually think are kind of cool regardless. Even if the vehicle sections are kind of hit or miss. The actual on-the-grounds gameplay, I think, is still pretty fun. Whether it's the shooting bits or the lightsaber combat bits. It's definitely an adrenaline rush, that's for sure. Challenging, but still an enjoyable game nonetheless. And so I wanted to at least give it a nomination. It may not be the best Super Nintendo game that's here, but I still want to at least give it my due diligence. Especially for being a decent alternative adaptation of a very iconic movie. So, yeah. And then next up, we've got ourselves King's Quest VII. Strangely enough, we haven't really talked too much about King's Quest. This is another one of those point-and-click adventure games that were very common around this time. Though this game is a very divided game by a lot of people, because this was a game that really changed the direction, like the general art direction of the series. It went for a more, Disney-inspired look for its visuals, and not everyone really took that to heart, but I actually think I like that change. It makes it stand out compared to the previous King's Quest games, especially the earlier games from the 80s, and gives it a bit more of life. It gives it a bit of a unique look, and was a very bold direction that was pretty much leading to a lot of games looking more and more like movies by this point. Like, this game, at points, does genuinely look like a movie that could have come out around this time period. And that's something that I think is worthy enough of a mention. And as someone who has a bit of a guilty pleasure of point-and-click games in general, I wanted to at least give it an honorable mention. Which then leads us to our final choice, which is a pretty obscure game, all things considered, but still an enjoyable one nonetheless. We've got Noctropolis. This was basically a spiritual successor to Shadowgate, if any of you guys know what that is. It was like a late 80s DOS game that was very popular, that was more of a general adventuring throughout an entire castle. That's kind of the same vibe that this game gives. So it's a lot less action based, and it's just more of a walking around kind of thing going on here. And I will admit, it is for a very, very, very specific audience. But it's still a game that I kind of like. Just the idea of solving a lot of puzzles to progress through a game. Yeah, I know I said I'm not the biggest fan of puzzle games, but I don't know. Sometimes you just want to play something that isn't really just action based. You just kind of want to play something that is a bit more just exploration based, and that's essentially what Necropolis is. As a matter of fact, I think this was a sequel to another game, right? Let me double check that. This was I think this was a no, but it was okay, but the studio that made it, they made other games. So actually, as a matter of fact, you know what? I'm gonna make an amendment now because actually, no, never mind. I'm not gonna change it. This was their first game, but unfortunately, the studio never really went anywhere. So, but sorry. But anyways, if you basically want Shadowgate but more comic book based, that's basically what Noctropolis is. So yeah, very different games across the board. As a matter of fact, you could definitely make a case that it's kind of stretching calling all of these games action adventures. But action adventure is always just kind of one of those genres that has always blurred the lines between other genres anyways. So, but yeah, let's go over the winner. Excuse me. So, here we go. The award for the best action adventure game of 1994 goes to Super Metroid. I could have chosen System Shock, but if I'm going to be honest, I think Super Metroid, as far as gameplay is concerned, has aged a lot better in my opinion. But even just beyond that, I do consider this to be an upgrade in every single way compared to the first Metroid game. The movement is way better here. The general presentation and just the general world building, I actually thought was very impressive for this game. Especially since this game has an intro area that doesn't necessarily play out as you expect. And, well, as a matter of fact, you almost die. Like, slight spoilers, not really, it's the very beginning of the game. The game tricks you into almost dying at the very beginning of the game. Which, nowadays, that's seen as a very common trope. And how this wasn't really the first game to do that either. But this was definitely the first game that popularized doing that motif. It set up a trope. So I gotta at least give it respect in that department. But even just besides that, this game honestly has some really good sense of progression. Meaning you get a lot of the items that you would, expect to get in a Metroid game very quickly in here. Or even just an action adventure game in general. Like you get the rolling ability and you get the mine ability very quickly into the game. It doesn't feel too long before you actually get some of the stuff that you want to mess around with. And that's a type of progression that I think really works for a game like this. And it's also helped by the fact that this game, it's not explicitly a platformer, though there are platforming bits. And it pretty much blended both of those elements of action, adventure, and platforming pretty damn good in my opinion. And helped pave the way to what eventually would become the Metroidvania sub-style of action-adventure platformer games. And so I gotta give credit where credit is due. And, well, bonus points for having some really damn good music. Super Metroid has some very creepy but also pretty damn good music. Alright, platformers! Again, we're in the era where platformers reign supreme, and so it should not surprise you that all the slots on here are pretty much taken by, pretty iconic games. Mostly, though there are some games that are hidden gems that I'd argue are pretty damn good in their own rights as well. But yeah, this is definitely a pretty big category for 94. Some of the biggest games in the genre would actually come out in 94. But what did I choose? Some obscure games, but also some pretty big names on here. So let's start with Skyblazer, which I'm just going to address this right now. I'm sorry that I had to choose a cover like that. I don't know if that's really the most culturally appropriate picture. It's just that's the only one I was able to find on SteamDB that fits, so I do apologize for that. That being said, though, this is essentially a Ninja Gaiden-like game. So you do a lot of parkouring, platforming in this game. And I think that's actually pretty cool. And I don't know, just the idea of having a game that is inspired by Hindu and Indian mythology, I think is actually pretty cool. And even just the general combat in this game, since it's an action platformer style, it was actually a lot of fun. I had a lot more fun than I probably should have had in this game. Especially since, again, it's a Ninja Gaiden-like, and so it has a lot of the same elements of the older Ninja Gaiden games. And I thought that was actually pretty fun. Definitely a hidden gem on the Super Nintendo. I'm pretty sure this is also on the Sega Genesis, but the Super Nintendo version, I think, is pretty damn good just by itself. And so, yeah, Skyblazer, it's a pretty decent action platformer that I'd recommend. So, especially one that has a different, different presentation compared to other games. So, yeah. Which, speaking of action platformers, that then leads us into Castlevania Bloodlines, which was exclusively released on the Sega Genesis. This was, I guess you can say, their response, in air quotes, to Super Castlevania 4, though it's a very different game in a lot of, actually, as a matter of fact, this is a very different game. But it's still a game that I think is pretty cool, nonetheless. It definitely has some things where they had to do some compromises, like the whip isn't as movable compared to the Super Castlevania 4, but it's still an enjoyable little experience nonetheless. And in my opinion, it sticks out more for it being a lot more, I guess, just visually interesting. Again, we're getting into the Bit Wars era, so as far as visual fidelity, that's really what matters around this time period, as opposed to general gameplay. But I don't know, I mean, I'm biased because I like Castlevania. Castlevania is one of my personal favorite series ever. It's really become one of my personal favorite video game series in recent years. So I am a little bit biased, but as far as a Genesis Castlevania game is concerned, it's actually pretty good. And then we got Sparkster, which, funny enough, there's two different versions of this game. There's the Super Nintendo version, and then there's the Genesis version. But both versions are pretty much viable. It's also an action platformer, which that is a very common thing, as you can probably tell. These first three games are action platformers. And I think that's actually, as far as being more, I guess it's kind of, I don't want to call it a Mega Man-like, because it's not really like a Mega Man, but it has a very similar move style as the Mega Man games. That's kind of the best comparison I can make. So, if you want basically just Anthro Mega Man, Starster is a decent choice. So, and one of the few, I guess, mascot platformers that has held up better than you would think. Trust me when I say that. That is a compliment. And then we got Demon's Crest, which, funny enough, is actually a spinoff of the Ghosts and Goblins series, where it's following the main gargoyle here, or demon. I don't really know what they're called. The devil, like the devil enemies from Ghosts and Goblins. You're basically following one of them, and granted, it's not as challenging, but I actually like that. Though there is still, I'm pretty sure there is still a time limit, which is one thing that is a bit annoying about that series in general, though I'm not going to get into the semantics about that. But point is, again, much like with Castlevania Bloodlines, this game is really carried by its cool fantasy design. Again, I'm a sucker for that type of stuff, and so because of that, I'm going to really like at least the visual aesthetics of Demon's Crest. And as far as being a bit of an easier question mark entry game for this series, it's a decent enough attempt, so I'm willing to give it a nod. But let's not get it twisted. These last two games are pretty iconic in their own rights. This was the year that Donkey Kong Country came out, alongside the sequel to Mega Man X, Mega Man X2. Donkey Kong Country pretty much was a very, very big deal when it came out, and is still a big deal in a lot of ways. I mean, this wasn't Rare's first big game, but I would definitely argue that this was the game that earned the respects of a lot of gamers back in the day. And for good reason. The level design is pretty good. The general control scheme is actually very fluid and solid. The swapping between multiple characters, obviously in this case Donkey and Diddy Kong, I think it was pretty cool. And just the use of the 3D models for the characters make this honestly one of the best looking Super Nintendo games of its time. And I gotta give props to it. Even though I am someone who will admit I am a bit of a Rare hater, I know, which, well, you know, like, I still hold by that, by the way, don't at me. Even I have to be like, yeah, no, this game's pretty cool. As far as its general level design. And then last but not least, we get ourselves Mega Man X2, which really isn't that different from Mega Man X1. It's just an example of a game that pretty much just uses the philosophy of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Because it's pretty much not exactly identical to Mega Man X1, of course, but it just continues a lot of the same stuff that a lot of people loved about Mega Man X. Which I think that's pretty cool, because this game is pretty decent. So if you like a Mega Man X, you're more than likely already going to like this game, if you haven't already played it. But yeah, let's go over the winner. We got ourselves some pretty decent choices here. But who's going to come on top? The answer is probably going to surprise a lot of people here. So, the award for the best platformer of 1994 goes to Donkey Kong Country. Again, if this was like 7-8 years ago, I would be raging. I would be livid by this choice. But, well, guess what? I grew the fuck up and I realized that, yeah, no, this is a good game. And as I've mentioned in a lot of these, more recent streams for this series, I just want something that isn't super serious, god damn it. I don't want to have everything super seriously. And this is a game that doesn't take itself seriously at all, which is a good thing. And it's helped by the fact that, well, as I already said, this game has some pretty damn good, smooth, buttery gameplay as far as movement. That is one of the biggest strengths that this game has. That this game, for a Super Nintendo game, is probably one of the smoothest games, or just platformers in general. It's not extremely janky. And that's something that I think is in this game's favor. And of course, the fact that you can actually technically play as both Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong, and they also act as lives themselves, it allows for a gameplay style that is dynamic without compromising too much as far as load times, if that makes any sense. It allows for a seamless transition between characters, and I like that. Of course, this game also has tons of collectibles for you to be able to find. It wasn't the first game to do to really be a collectathon, but it was definitely the first game that popularized the idea of platformers being collectathons. And so the idea of being able to collect stuff stuck with this game. And as I've already mentioned, this game, for a Super Nintendo game, does look absolutely gorgeous. It really was a game that pushed the Super Nintendo to its limits as far as visuals. I can't really think of too many other games on the console that look as good as this. So, yeah. Pretty damn good game. Just don't get me nearby those bees or wasps or whatever the hell those things are on the cover, because I hate bugs. But yeah, that then leads us into the next category, the role-playing game category. Goddamn, the mid-90s was killing it as far as role-playing games. There were so many games in the role-playing game category that I unfortunately had to snub. And so no matter what I choose, there's going to be one person out there who's going to be upset that I didn't choose their favorite RPG of all time on here. I can guarantee it. But that's just how damn good the mid-90s were for this category in general. So this is no disrespect to any of the RPGs that came out of that era. Let it be known. But ultimately, I had to only choose up to 6 games. And frankly, these are pretty iconic games in their own respects. So let's begin by talking about Shin Megami Tensei 2. So the first game came out in 88, I believe. So this is a long-awaited sequel. And as far as sequels are concerned to, a pretty iconic Japanese RPG series, this was well worth the wait in a lot of people's eyes. And I can definitely see it. Some of the improvements that they had include, speeding up a lot of the combat in this game, taking a lot of cues, funny enough, from a lot of Square Enix games, and applying them to the formulas here. Having it to where you can actually see party members and all that fun stuff. That was something that was a big deal with this game. And I don't know, just the general sort of mix between contemporary and fantasy. Usually I'm not the biggest fan of. I am not a big fan of urban fantasy at all. Just straight up. But this was definitely a game that was able to do that in a more tasteful manner. And I don't know, I just think that, works out in its favor. Especially for a game like this. And then we got Star Wars Ultima 8 Pagan. Which, by that name, that should pretty much tell you everything you need to know about this. And it's fine. It's a little decent, Western RPG. Obviously, a bit more on the medieval side of things, so do keep that in mind. But yeah, no, it's just another, typical isometric, RPG from around that time. Admittedly, it's kind of the weakest game in this entire lineup, but that doesn't necessarily make it a bad game. So yeah, if you like isometric RPGs, especially the ones that are fantasy-based, this one's fine. But lo and behold, that's not even close to how big of a game this next one is. We got ourselves The Elder Scrolls Arena. Yes, The Elder Scrolls debuted in 1994, starting off with Arena. Which, funny enough, covered the entirety of Tamriel. Yes, this was a game that fully covered the entire map of Tamriel. It wasn't until Daggerfall where they started to make it a bit more specific. But yeah, as far as being amongst one of the first-person role-playing games are concerned, it's not too bad, especially since there's a lot of customization that you are able to do as far as being able to create your own character. Granted, it wasn't really as much as some of the later games in the series. You still had quite a few limitations. But the fact that you were able to even have your own builds was a big deal for the time. So as far as Western RPGs are concerned, I at least do have to respect it. Even if it's not the best Elder Scrolls game. That's just kind of my thing. But either way, I'll be right back. So, because I heard someone knock on the door. Alright, sorry about that. Just getting some food. But anyways, so yeah. Elder Scrolls Arena. It may not be the best Elder Scrolls games, but I do respect it. But as far as big names, these next two are also two names that you can't really ignore. But let's start with Final Fantasy VI. Or Final Fantasy III in North America. Again, for those who want context, Final Fantasies 2, 3, and 5 were not released in North America until much later. But Final Fantasy 4 was. And whenever that released in North America, they just called that Final Fantasy 2. And then Final Fantasy 6 released in North America, but not Final Fantasy 5, so they just called it Final Fantasy 3 in the States. It's confusing, it's dumb, I don't know why they just didn't release the other games here, but whatever. Point is, we're just going to call it by its actual name, Final Fantasy VI. Just for the sake of the stream. Because, again, it's the 6th Final Fantasy game, and released in Japan as Final Fantasy VI. But beside, semantics aside, oh my god, Final Fantasy VI is a game changer for Final Fantasy as a whole. Really leaning into the science fiction-y stuff that Final Fantasy has had, but never really leaned towards until this game. Has a story that really did break a lot of tropes, even for the time. And is widely regarded by many to be one of the best games just of all time. I mean, many Final Fantasy games are, but in this particular case, I can definitely see it. So, pretty big deal as far as role-playing games from around this time. But it's not the only game that is highly regarded as far as role-playing games are concerned from 94. Because you also got Earthbound here. Which, again, if you were talking to me 7-8 years ago, I would be livid. But again, I grew up and I realized that, yeah, no, this is a good game. And a very unique game at that. And by the way, this came out in 94 in Japan. I know it came out in 95 in North America, but again, we're talking about the Japanese release as being the initial release. But anyways, yeah, no, Earthbound is just one of those games that just kind of dropped, and Nintendo just kind of ignored for a good decade until around, I'd say, 2007 or 8. And once this started to blow up, oh my god, it became a cult hit. It admittedly was a bit of a sleeper hit, but it was definitely a game that really wasn't anything like anything else from from 94. And frankly, there's a lot of, there's still not many games that are like it. There have been a bunch of games that have tried emulating a lot of what Earthbound did, but as far as being a game as weird as it is, it's a very big step in that, thing. So, yeah, no. Both of these games really did change the landscape of role-playing games. Not necessarily overnight, but definitely enough in a way that just shook the JRPG scene. Which, of course, this us to our last game over here, Live a Life, which, yes, we did talk about its remake before, back in the 2023 the first episode. Jesus Christ. But again, that was a re-release / remaster of this game. And we're actually going to nominate the original release here. It's really not that different from Shin Megami Tensei, if I'm going to be honest. Just a bit more Square. Since this was a Square Enix game, or a Square game. Or wait, was it Square or was it Enix? Let me double check, because I keep forgetting. Live Alive. It was Square, yes. So it has a lot of that, Square JRPG feel to it. But as far as being another more contemporary RPG, it's actually a pretty decent game. So, you want something that is a bit more of like a tactical based one, because it's also kind of a strategy game as well. Live a Life, not too bad of a genre blender right there. But let's be real here. This winner is really between 4 of the games we talked about. And it can honestly go either way. But ultimately, we can only have one winner, and so here we go. And no matter what I'm going to say, it's going to piss some people off. Hell, it's going to... Yeah, whatever. Let's just go over it. So, the award for the best role-playing game of 1994 goes to... Earthbound! high school me is livid right now. What? How dare you choose 3 Super Nintendo games? Nintendo sucks ass. They've never done something good. Okay, they might suck now, but the Super Nintendo era, at least in my opinion, is when they peaked. And this is another example of a Super Nintendo game that absolutely knocked it out of the park in a lot of ways. Though it's really not because of the gameplay. Because the gameplay is really not that different from something like Dragon Quest. It's honestly the same, a lot of the same mechanics. Just with some, text flair to make it fit the setting a bit more. But that is why this game is why it stands out. Is because this was a contemporary setting set in basically just the 1990s that was able to just be a bit more relatable compared to other RPGs. And I think that's ultimately why this game captivated a lot of people at the time. And it's honestly kind of one of the few exceptions of a contemporary RPG that I think is actually kind of cool. And like I said, there were definitely a lot of games that have tried to emulate this style. I mean, Omori and Undertale come to mind, although I never really was a big fan of the latter. And you could probably also name a bunch of other games that were inspired. But that is kind of why I think I appreciate this game even more. It's because this game, because it was unique as far as its presentation, I think that's why ultimately this stuck around with a lot of people. It was a game that was, on its surface, just kind of a typical, kids-like game. But as you go through the game more and more, holy shit, it gets really dark. Like, Jesus Christ, this game is pretty grim at points. And just having a lot of these moral dilemmas throughout the game itself, I think adds a lot to its charm. Especially when you start getting into some of the really, really weird shit. Like some of the weird ass enemies in here, or even just the background designs of a lot of the battle scenes. Go play it if you want to know what I'm talking about. It's definitely a game that, well, similar to Final Fantasy VI, it broke a lot of tropes. And just a lot of the moral and interpretive stuff is really what makes this game stand out. So, yeah. And here's the kicker. This isn't even technically the first game in its series, because it's part of a trilogy called the Mother Trilogy. And this is actually the second game in the series, although most people know of this game just kind of being on its own, because you don't really need to play Mother 1 to really understand what's going on. You just play this as it is. But I don't know, just the fact that this game was as weird as it was, I think is what made it unique. I'm not spoiling it for people who want to check it out, by the way. Just play it for yourselves. Granted, the only viable way to play it is, unfortunately, either by pirating the game or, well, getting a Super Nintendo Classic. So, because it actually does come with this alongside Super Metroid and Donkey Kong Country, thank God. So, but yeah, Earthbound is a game that I definitely think you guys should check out. Alright, shooter games. So, 94, I think, was definitely the year that the first-person shooter was really starting to finally take shape. Though, keep in mind, there are going to be some there is actually, okay, matter of fact, only one game on here that isn't a first-person shooter. It's just a rail shooter. Although, it is an enjoyable rail shooter, to be honest. But as far as the shooter category here, you can definitely tell we are still in the infancy era of first-person shooters. So let's talk about them. So it should not surprise you that Marathon and Heretic are going to be nominated on here. That is pretty much a given. I think that Heretic is a pretty damn good game. And Marathon, even though I do have my problems with it, I still respect it enough to nominate it here. But then that gets us into the other games on here. So first of all, Wild Guns, the only non-first-person shooter that's on this list. It is a rail I guess it's technically a rail shooter, but it's more of a shoot 'em up, I guess. I don't know. It's like it's like the sequences from Contra where it's like a forward direction, but if that's the entire game, that's essentially what this is. And this is kind of like an alternate Wild West where you're fighting a bunch of, robotic forces here. It's actually a lot more enjoyable than you would think. And, well, I can thankfully say that this is a certified not racist game because you're not shooting a bunch of Native Americans. You're just shooting a bunch of cowboys and robots, which is something that I can always appreciate. So this is a certified not racist game. So let's rejoice on that. Thank God racism died in the early 90s. Not really, but Point is that if you want a bit of a decent shoot 'em up rail shooter style, Wild Guns for the Super Nintendo is not a bad choice. Doom 2 Hell on Earth is also on here. Yeah, Doom 2, the sequel to one of the most important games of all time. A game that we also covered 3 years ago. Actually, as a matter of fact, we played this right before we played Heretic. Doom 2? I really like Doom 2. I think that it's real, again, similar to Mega Man X2, it really isn't too much different from its predecessor, only having a few different things with it. But it's still a game that you can still enjoy to this day, and honestly, have fun with it. So if I don't know, I don't really have anything else to say other than it's Doom 2. It's a really damn good game in its own right. It really is just a continuation of what made the first Doom as good as it was. I don't think I need to really say anything else. But then that gets us into our last two choices, which this first one, I know people are going to laugh because this game was originally on hardware that was a bit of a joke at the time. And truth be told, it is a joke. But let it be known. Let it be known. Let the word be known. Alien vs. Predator for the Atari Jaguar is actually a pretty decent game. Yes, I said that. It is actually a pretty decent adaptation of the Alien vs. Predator comics. Granted, it's not fully a first-person shooter. It's kind of a blending of both first-person shooter and action game, considering that, the Predator and the Marines are the only ones with guns. The Xenomorphs don't actually have a gun, which, that makes sense. But even just playing on this type of hardware, this is actually a pretty decent game just by itself. Yeah, the Jaguar was definitely a bit of a joke in a lot of ways. It was really just style over substance. But this was one of the few games I'm actually willing to defend from the system. And a game that, yeah, it was kind of, I don't want to say it's ahead of its time, because I hate using that term. But it was definitely a different style of shooter game. It was a lot more slower paced. And because of that, I think I can at least appreciate it more than probably a lot of people would think. And as someone who's a bit of a sucker for both Alien and for Predator, I'm willing to give this game a pass. And then last but not least, we've got ourselves a game that Might be a bit controversial that I'm having this on the 94 list and not the 95 list. We got ourselves Rise of the Triad Dark War. I say controversial because it technically didn't fully release in 94. The first third of the game did, but then the rest of the game came out in 95. It's kind of a Shantae and the Seven Sirens situation, where the first half of that game came out on mobile devices in 2019, but then the second half of the game came out in 2020 on consoles. It's a weird release. I don't know why that's like a thing that companies do. It's not an episodic game. It just, shareware versions. I don't know. But I'm going to nominate for 94 because that is when the official portion of the game came out. And hell, it actually came out the same day as Marathon. And also, funny enough, this was originally supposed to be a sequel to Wolfenstein 3D. This was supposed to be Wolfenstein 2, which is why a lot of the guys look like they're supposed to be like German officers and you're carrying an MP40 throughout the game. But, well, it's not. You're not in World War II. But as far as a bit of a goofier style of retro shooter game, it's pretty decent. I'm not gonna pretend it's a masterpiece. It's just a little enjoyable, game that, funny enough, was actually built upon Wolfenstein 3D's engine. Funny enough, it was not built upon Doom's engine. So yeah, I don't know. It's a game that it's very much a niche, even for retro shooters. I think it's pretty cool. So yeah. But let's go over the winner. I think it's pretty obvious what's going to win, but I'm still going to do my thing anyways. So, the award for the best shooter game of 1994 goes to Doom 2 Hell on Earth. This might feel like it's cheating because it's really not that different from the original Doom. But again, it's a philosophy of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that's a philosophy that I think this is definitely one of the games where that should apply to. And we've even given wins to several games before in the past that had that same philosophy. And so it's only fair for me to be able to do that for Doom 2. But even just besides the fact that it really was just Doom, there were still some things that it did that I thought did pretty well. So first of all, the enemies. There were some new enemies that were introduced here, which helped shake up the formula a bit. You had your Hell Knights, you had your Revenants. These were, of course, the Icon of Sin boss fight that was introduced in here, even if the Icon of Sin was kind of lame in this game, but whatever. Point is, I think the new enemies added enough variety and still feel in place with the enemies that were in the original game. They didn't really feel out of place or felt too much like a hindrance when fighting against them, for the most part. So as far as that's concerned, I thought that was pretty good. Also, the fact that this game had a lot more vertical level design compared to the original Doom, I think helps in this game make it stand out. There's some vertical level design that's in the original Doom, but they didn't start really going crazy with it until this game. And I think that helps with, at least in this game's favor, especially since a lot of this game does take place on Earth itself, even if the buildings still kind of look like you're in hell, but whatever, that's just kind of an aesthetic problem with a lot of games from this time period. I'm not going to blame it on Doom 2 specifically. So, yeah. Also, the super shotgun is pretty fun to use. I just wanted to give that a bullet point because super shotgun is pretty fun to use in this game and helps fight up against a lot of the tougher enemies. And, well, I already said this. Why fix what isn't broken? So, also, relating back to the heretic point, mod support as a bonus point here. So, alright, let's move on. I'm pretty sure we're almost done anyways. Again, we only have 8 categories this time around, so this is like, I think, the last genre category. But again, 94 was a hell of a year for sim and strategy games as a whole. Oh my god. This arguably was another really damn good year for this category in general. Hell, a lot of games also are going to be snubbed here. And I feel so bad for everyone who is going to be upset about the fact that there's going to be a lot of snubs. But ultimately, I do think that these are the games that, in my opinion, are the best choices for this category. And so let's go and cover what we've got here. So XCOM UFO Defense is going to be nominated on here, as we did earlier. But also, I'm going to be nominating a few other games. Well, a lot of other games. So first of all, let's talk about Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem. Fire Emblem 3. So this was a Japanese-only release for the longest time. Excuse me, oh my god, I'm sorry. So this was a Japanese-only release for the longest time until fairly recently. Though I have played fan translations of this game. Funny enough, this is kind of a Hitman contract situation where half the game are original missions, while the other half of the game is essentially kind of a remake of the first Fire Emblem game. Yeah, it's kind of one of those situations. But I think that the improvements that they used to jump from the NES to the Super Nintendo, I think work in favor here a lot. Making the actual battle scenarios a lot quicker was definitely a noticeable improvement here. Also, just the fact that this game has generally much better art direction compared to its NES counterparts, I think is a huge plus. And this, I feel like, was definitely the game that really pushed Fire Emblem to become a household name, at least in Japan. It wouldn't be until much other entries later down the line in North America for it to have a bit of a hold. But this was definitely the game that I feel like really, really started to give it a bit of recognition in its home country. So because of that, I'm willing to give it a nomination here. Next up, we got ourselves Theme Park, which is a part of the Theme series of simulation games. I think we mentioned Themed Hospital a few episodes back. And so this is a Bullfrog Productions game, which, if you guys know, I actually am a bit of a sucker for Bullfrog Production. Some of their games that they made are from around this time. And for being one of the earliest examples of a theme park simulation, like business simulation game for a theme park, this was a pretty decent attempt. It took a lot, funny enough, it took a lot of inspiration from Railroad Tycoon, of all things. So there's a lot more direct involvement with the actual economics of this compared to some of your more modern, business simulation games. So if that's something that appeals to you, Theme Park, honestly, it's not a bad choice. And then we got ourselves Star Wars TIE Fighter, the indirect sequel to Star Wars X-Wing that came out a year prior. And wow, what a jump as far as graphics. I mean, the original Star Wars X-Wing game was already visually damn impressive, The fact that they were able to top themselves here, oh my god, it's insane. Which I guess is why they released a special edition of that game in 95, but that's neither here nor there. Point is, it's really much the same game, but Empire themed. But Star Wars X-Wing is already a really fantastic game in its own right, so if you basically just wanted that for the Empire, here you go. That's all I gotta really say. Actually, before we talk about this game, I'm going to talk about the other flight sim on here, Wing Commander 3. So this, speaking of Star Wars, and speaking of flight sims, this actually brought in Mark Hamill. Yes, this was the first game to feature Mark Hamill in the Wing Commander series, and Malcolm McDowell. So, yeah, as far as like big name celebrities, this was one of the first games to really have that, which is a big, big deal. Because, again, this is the mid-90s. Video games were still kind of seen as a bit childish in a lot of people's eyes. They were not taken as seriously as movies or television or even music at the time. But by the time that this game came around, and having these big talents, oh yeah, no, that was a big deal. And even just kind of beyond that, it's still a pretty good flight sim. It continued a lot of the good space combat that Wing Commander had, just obviously a bit more refined and fine-tuned. And yeah, no, this is just an enjoyable little experience, and continuing the just, the whole, human alien tiger people conflict thing. I forgot the name of the species. I sincerely apologize. But the point is funny enough, a very important step as far as video games. Funny enough. So yeah, I'm willing to give Wing Commander a nod. And then last but not least, we ourselves Warcraft, Orcs and Humans. Technically not the first real-time strategy game, but definitely the first game that brought it to the mainstream. And this game was a big deal in a lot of ways. I mean, it's helped by the fact that this was originally supposed to be a Warhammer fantasy game, but then Blizzard and Games Workshop had a bit of a conflict, like they conflicted with each other on ideas, and so this eventually became its own original IP, which is why the Warcraft orcs look so much like Warhammer orcs. It's because this was supposed to be a Warhammer game, but that ended up not really happening. But as far as a game that started a pretty big genre, yeah, no, Warcraft, Orcs and Humans, I do respect. Fuck you, Blizzard, for removing it off of GOG recently. So, yeah, I wanted to bring up that elephant in the room. Unfortunately, as of December 13th, 2024, which was just 3 years prior to the recording of this stream, Warcrafts 1 and 2 were removed from Good Old Games in favor of a remaster of both of them that is on Blizzard's website. That's probably just going to be another Warcraft 3 Reforged situation. And so because of that, I had to rush in and make sure that I got a digital copy from GOG before they got rid of it, like from digital storefronts. Which is a damn shame, because this game is very important to gaming history, and being able to play the original version, in my opinion, is extremely important. The fact that Blizzard feels like it's okay for them to remove history is fucked up. Especially considering that this was one of the games that got them to where they are now. So, if you guys can, either find a physical copy of this game, or just pirate it. And I'm willing to just tell you to pirate it. So, I just wanted to make sure that I had it on GOG. But in any event, it's still a good game, and so I'm at least willing to give it a nod. But let's go over the winner, shall we? So, the award for the best sim strategy game of 1994 goes to XCOM UFO Defense. If you guys know me, you guys know how much I love XCOM, especially the newer games. But even as early as the mid-90s, you can tell that they were a bit of, this franchise was a bit on a bit of a roll. Cuz this game holds up to this day. I mean, you might have to do some like PC gaming website, like PC gaming wiki fixes for you to be able to run the game properly. And there might be some weird button prompts that modern computers definitely don't use nowadays. But I'm just going to genuinely tell you that this is a game that was ahead of its time. The blending of both real-time and turn-based strategy was not anything that was done before. And is something that was fairly unique for this style, like just for strategy games as a whole. Because you were either a turn-based strategy game like Civilization, or you were kind of a real-time strategy style of game like Warcraft, or the Dune game that came out like a few years prior. This game basically took the idea of having an overhead real-time-ish system while still having a turn-based battle system fighting against alien forces. Which then gets us into our next point. This game, when playing it, actually gives me some of the this game gives me the creeps. Because you are fighting a lot in like farmland in this game, with some cityscapes, but definitely a lot of like, dead rural farmland. And I don't know, it just gives me the creeps, but in a good way. It adds to the atmosphere that, not only is this place, you guys are not alone, but you don't know what's out there. And just that fear of the unknown really adds to this game. I don't know how to describe it. It's just one of those games that really did well as far as like, putting the player on edge. And, well, that then gets us into our next point. This game doesn't actually use pre-rendered maps. It was one of the first games that really relied on randomly generated maps as well as randomly generated events. And so, with that, adds a lot of replay value. It was one of the first games that really took advantage of that. So, your playthrough is going to be completely different from someone else's. And I think that works in its favor. And of course, I have to give credit to the fact that this helped give the rise to more turn-based tactics style of strategy games, which is a style of strategy that I really, really, really do love. And I gotta give credit where credit is due. XCOM UFO Defense, definitely one of the best games to begin that sort of genre. So, at the end of the day, this is definitely my pick. I know people would probably choose Warcraft, but in my opinion, XCOM definitely deserves the win here. Alright, art direction. Funny enough, this is a category that actually has a lot of unique games on here. There's going to be some that we've already talked about, but there were a lot of games that came out. Granted, some licensed games, but they just look beautiful for their systems. And so because of that, I straight up just had to be like, you know what? I have to give them at least a nomination. I'm going to give them an art direction here, because I'm not going to lie, these games look pretty damn good for their systems. So let's go over that, shall we? So I'm going to nominate Super Metroid, Earthbound, and Donkey Kong Country for this category. Super Metroid, of course, for its cool science fiction, horror adjacent look that they heavily improved upon compared to the previous Metroid game. Earthbound for its wacky but interesting mix of like weird, whimsical, grim, dystopian, contemporary. I don't know how to describe it, but just that style Earthbound does very well, and not many games have done since. And of course, Donkey Kong Country, because of just how beautiful the game looks, especially for this late of a Super Nintendo game. Oh my god, it looks so damn good. But those aren't the only games that looked pretty damn good for the respective systems, because I'm going to also give a bit of a nomination to 2 licensed games and, well, another Blizzard game, funny enough. So let's start off with Blackthorn. This was a Blizzard game that actually predates Warcraft. It was their first... Okay, it wasn't their first game that got them attention, so that's why I didn't give them the best game by new studio, because it technically was not their first. It was technically not the first game that got them attention, but it was definitely a game that set the tone of their games from this point onwards, because this was basically just a 40K game in everything but name, and was a platformer. Because you were, you're fighting against a bunch of orcs that are, taking over like humanity, but in a sci-fi setting. And as far as cinematic platformers are concerned, games like Prince of Persia and like Oddworld, those types of platformers, this is a part of that lineage. Yeah, no, this game definitely has really good art direction in that respect, especially on the console versions of this game. Oh my god, this is a console release? Again, it just proves, I'm just trying to point out that the Super Nintendo was way better than people really give it credit for. And this is just another example of a game that was able to do that so well. So damn well. And so yeah, Blackthorn, I'm going to give it a nomination here. And then that gives us into the Disney games. So let's start up with Mickey Mania, The Timeless Adventures of Mickey Mouse. So this game is basically a retelling of a lot of Mickey Mouse cartoons that were released since the 20s all the way up until the 90s. Most people know it for its PlayStation 1 version, but this game originally came out on the Sega Genesis. And it looks pretty good, and the levels themselves accurately represent whatever type of Mickey Mouse cartoon that they're supposed to be in. I mean, it replicates Steamboat Willie. This doctor thing, I forgot the name of it, but it's the one where, the mad scientist is kind of a bit of a weirdo. There's a few other... Oh, yeah, the flight, the fancy free one, which admittedly, that Disney movie wasn't particularly all that great, but it was a part of that, Jack and the Beanstalk Mickey Mouse cartoon. And then like a few other ones that I can't really think of off the top of my head. But as far as visually making those levels as good as they could for 16-bit hardware, I gotta be real. This game is pretty impressive in that regard. I'm not gonna complain. And the same thing goes with the Lion King game. Especially, like, the second area, once you get to Just Can't Wait to Be a King. That was just colorful bliss. I don't know how to describe it. Granted, I was honestly this close to having this as a platformer nominee, but it is just a bit too hard at points. It controls pretty damn smooth as far as a, licensed game is concerned from this time period. But this game is definitely carried more by its visuals, being able to replicate the landscapes and even just the animals that you see in Lion King. I think it does it as good as you could for at least for the Super Nintendo version. I'm not too sure about the Genesis version, but definitely the Super Nintendo version, I think, really stands out. Even if Simba himself is probably the weakest looking character in that game, but everything else about that game looks fantastic. It actually surprised me how damn good that game looked. And again, proves my point that the Super Nintendo is the most timeless console to ever release. And I still stand by that. Which, I mean, most of these games on here are Super Nintendo games. So, let's go over the winner. So, the award for the best art direction of 1994 goes to Blackthorn. Blackthorn. A forgotten little gem within Blizzard's catalog, which is pretty sad because, well, these are the types of games that they should be making and not, harassing women, but that's besides the point. Point is, Blackthorn is definitely representative of what the studio was building up to be in a good way. And this game is actually one of those games that I would actually say is one of the most underrated games from this era. Like I said, it has that sort of grim, dark science fiction look, which makes sense since this most likely was supposed to be a 40K game, but that ended up not happening. But because it was a cinematic platformer, they really emphasized the smooth animations with this game. Especially when you're hiding in cover and when you're shooting enemies. Because, well, that's your main attack in this game, is a gun. A shotgun, specifically. And it just, for a Super Nintendo game, it really did push, like, similar to Donkey Kong Country, this game pushed that console's, like, graphics to its limits. Especially with those, animations. It really was a game that, honestly, again, is a game that, if it was made this year by an indie studio, it would not feel out of place. And it's helped by the fact that the cutscenes look like they were made for DOS or PC. Again, I'm giving a lot of praise to this game because it looks like a game that literally could have been made for DOS, which there was a DOS/PC release, of course. But this was also made for the Super Nintendo and the Sega 32X. My god. Whoever made this game, you guys are talented motherfuckers. Oh my god. So, yeah. In my opinion, best art direction. I mean, I like the aesthetics anyways, but just with the added technical feats that they were able to do with this game, I'm going to choose this for best art direction. But that then leads us into the final award of the night, the titular game of the year. And we've again established that 1994 is nowhere close to being the worst year as far as gaming history. As a matter of fact, I would argue that it was definitely a pretty good year in a lot of ways. Were there some gaming events that were kind of annoying from 94? Yes. Was there definitely a lot of shovelware that was released that year? Hell yes. But this was still a pretty impressive year in a lot of ways. And that's very reflective with the games I ended up choosing for the game of the year. So it should not surprise you. Super Metroid, Final Fantasy VI, Earthbound, Doom 2, Donkey Kong Country, and Warcraft Orcs and Humans are all going to be the games that are going to be nominated here. Especially since I do feel like that these are the games that I feel like people know the most from this from this year. And so I think it's pretty fitting to have games that are a bit more recognizable here anyways. But even just besides that, I could make a good case that every single one of these games are culturally iconic for their respective genres. Super Metroid for action adventures, Donkey Kong Country for platformers, Warcraft for strategy games. Even if it's not the game that won Sim Strategy, it's a pretty big deal in a lot of people's eyes. Doom 2 for shooter games, and of course Earthbound and Final Fantasy VI for the role-playing game genre as a whole. So, I don't think anyone's going to complain about these choices here. And do I really need to repeat myself on what I've already said about these games? You already know why these games are as big of a deal as they were. But of course, as always, there can only be one winner. You guys know the phrase. So, let's go over the winner. Which may surprise some people, because it can go any way. But ultimately, I do think that what I'm going to choose here is probably the best choice for 1994. And I'd argue is one of the most important games to have been made ever. Because it really was leaning towards the direction in which gaming would become for decades to come afterwards. So let's go over the winner. So here we go. The final award of the night. The award for the 1994 Game of the Year goes to Final Fantasy VI. Oh, Final Fantasy VI. Or Final Fantasy III in North America. You were a very damn big deal when you initially released. And even to this day, people swear that you are the best Final Fantasy game ever. Yes, even better than Final Fantasy VII, which you can definitely have your agreements or disagreements about that. But that's just how damn big of a deal Final Fantasy VI was. That it was a cultural phenomenon that really did push the Final Fantasy brand to how it is today. And it's helped by the fact that this game really was just the cultivation of the ideas that were built in the previous 5 games, all wrapped into one package. So, of course, this game, I'd say it's definitely most notable for a lot of the twists that this game brought. It subverted expectations in ways that weren't really done in a lot of games at this point, and did it in a way that didn't feel cheap. It felt like there were higher stakes than you would have thought about. I mean, slight spoiler alert, but not exactly. Your team, like your party members, not only do they shift around, there's some that do eventually die. Your actions have consequences in this game. And this was one of the first games to really emphasize that. Is that your choices kind of do matter at the end of the day. And just that idea of having these, characters that people have a lot of attachment to and pretty much getting sacrificed. That was just unheard of for gaming. Like, even compared to other Final Fantasy games, that was a big deal. And it's helped by the fact that this game pretty much is the quintessential way in which Final Fantasy played for the longest time. It really wasn't that different from the previous games mechanically, but just it was fine-tuned in a way to which it was really just no flaws to have. I mean, it's the same battle. It was the same turn-based battle system, but just fine-tuned to how Final Fantasy would do it for all the 3D games. Couple that by the fact that this game has a very memorable villain, Kefka, who isn't the only villain, but he's like the most memorable one. I mean, just that laugh. It's like, ugh. And well, just the memorable atmosphere. Being a more science fiction-y, almost steampunk-like game, definitely made it stand out compared to, well, any other Final Fantasy game, because this was the first non-fantasy Final Fantasy game, which I can see why people may not like that, but it was definitely an interesting direction that was a bold move, and I think the move was pretty good here. But also, I'd argue that this game is very important for two distinct reasons. So number one, this represented a more serious tone shift in the gaming landscape. Because most games released in the 80s and early 90s, they didn't really take themselves seriously at all. I mean, yeah, they may have replicated more serious scenes in movies, but it's kind of hard to do that when it comes to 8-bit hardware. And even going into the earlier half of the Super Nintendo era, Sega Genesis era, again, a lot of the games that were being made were definitely a lot more lighthearted, or just straight up made for kids. But this was one of the games that really did take itself super seriously. And there were very few games that were like that. Even Doom, as a game that was definitely a rated M game at the time, or even Mortal Kombat, games that were definitely for a mature audience, they didn't really have a lot to say, and they weren't really games that took themselves seriously as far as the narrative department is concerned. This was definitely one of the games that pretty much pushed the boundaries for how you could do a narrative in a game. Which I know I've been saying that a lot for a lot of games here, but again, I guess I'm just pointing out that we wouldn't have a game like Metal Gear Solid or like Silent Hill 2 if it weren't for games like Final Fantasy helping build a lot of the foundations for having an in-depth narrative. And, well, this might be a bit of a hot take because I know people consider Final Fantasy to be the first one of these, but I would make a good case that it's truly Final Fantasy VI that's the first true AAA game to have been made, at least in my opinion. Because it's estimated that this game had between a $5 to $10 million budget, which is insane now, for the time. No game costed that much at the time. Which, of course, Final Fantasy VII would blow that out of the water with its $40 million budget. But the fact that this game has up to a $10 million budget really also helped kind of showcase the direction that gaming was going towards from this point onwards. And hell, this game, I'm pretty sure costed $80. No game on the Super Nintendo costed that much, except for this game. And again, that was because of how big of a game this was, just on its scope, and just how much they spent making the game. And so, in my opinion, I think it's comfortable to say that this is truly the first AAA game. At least in my personal opinion. You can definitely argue if there was any game that came out before or after, but keep in mind that is also not including marketing costs, because if we were counting marketing costs, then we would count Super Mario World, but I don't think anyone really call that a AAA game, though you can be the judge on that. But either way, Final Fantasy VI, I do consider to be one of the most important games ever made, and that's why I chose it for Game of the Year for 1994. So let's recap, shall we? So, for the best game by a new studio, we chose Heretic. For the best action adventure, we gave it to Super Metroid. For best platformer, we gave it to Donkey Kong Country. For best RPG, we gave it to Earthbound. best shooter game, we gave it to Doom 2. For best sim strategy, we gave it to XCOM UFO Defense. For best art direction, we gave it to Blackthorn. And for game of the year, we gave it to Final Fantasy VI. As far as my personal top 10 favorite games of this year, they do kind of shift. But as of right now, these are the games that I would say are my personal favorites from that year, being Super Metroid, Doom 2, Final Fantasy VI, Donkey Kong Country, Heretic, Blackthorn, XCOM UFO Defense, Star Wars TIE Fighter, Warcraft Orcs and Humans, and Wing Commander 3. And of course, let's not forget about the honorable mentions / the guilty pleasures, as always. So, of course, these are the games I chose. We got Brain Lord, which is kind of a decent little JRPG by Square that they made. Or no, Enix. This was an Enix game, excuse me, that they made, which I thought was pretty cool. Mech Warrior 3050 being a sequel to Mech Warrior that came out a few years prior. That was pretty decent as well. The Sega Genesis version of Shadowrun, which is not the same game as the Super Nintendo Shadowrun. Do keep that in mind. This is a very different game, which I thought was a decent little experience. Not as good as the Super Nintendo version, but I still wanted to give it a shout out. Tempest 2000 for being a shooter puzzle game, which that was on the Atari Jaguar. That I don't know. I just think it was kind of cool. There was also a PS1 port of this, and I'm pretty sure a Sega Saturn port, so that's cool. Then we've got ourselves a different Alien vs. Predator game, not to be confused with the Jaguar version. This is actually the Capcom arcade beat 'em up, which I thought was actually kind of cool playing around with. Soul Star, which was just kind of a typical, space shoot 'em up game, which I thought was neat. Indiana Jones' Greatest Adventures, which was kind of like the Super Star Wars games, in which this was basically just a recreation of the first 3 Indiana Jones games, just in one game, that I thought was pretty decent. Breath of Fire 2 being another decent little JRPG that I thought was nice. The original Need for Speed, which definitely would have been in our best sports racing fighting game category if we still had that, but again, it's not really my personal favorite category, but I still wanted to at least give it an honorable mention. So there you go. 1942, The Pacific Air War, not to be confused with 1942, the arcade game. This is a completely unrelated game, but as far as World War II flight simulator games, I thought was actually pretty decent. Microsoft Space Simulator, a kind of a forgotten game, like a sub game of Microsoft Flight Simulator, that I think is actually pretty underrated and visually pretty impressive for the time, being able to explore the solar system. I wanted to give it a nod. Panzer General, which is kind of a spiritual successor to the Hearts of Iron games. Kind of a grand-ish strategy game, which was ahead of its time, but I wanted to give it an honorable mention. And then we got Urban Strike, which is also just kind of a typical shoot 'em up that was for the Super Nintendo, that I thought was pretty neat. So yeah, overall, 94. Oh shoot, 94. A pretty decent year, I'd say. Definitely not the best year, but a year that I think people think too harshly of. So, yeah. Stay tuned for 1993. And I hope you guys did thoroughly enjoy this stream. If you guys did, of course, if you guys can, make sure you guys do the typical Twitch and YouTube pleasantries. If you're watching this on Twitch, of course, hit the follow button and the bell icon. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit the subscribe and the bell icon and the like button. I would definitely appreciate if you guys do. While you guys are at it, of course, make sure you guys check out the links down below, especially the Discord, SoundCloud, and the Linktree links, if you want to check out all my other content. If you guys also want to directly support me, you can also hit the subscribe button over on Twitch. If you can't do that, that's completely fine. I'm so glad that you guys took time to watch this. But regardless of all that, though, make sure to share the stream to other people as well, and continue to be awesome people in the process. But until then, I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good night, and peace out. Bye.